I spent 5 years rebuilding my life from the ashes of a man who left me to die, only for him to crawl back onto my doorstep, bleeding, hunted, and holding the key to a global conspiracy. Now, the people who destroyed my past are at my door, and I have to decide if I'm going to run or finally burn it all down. The silence in my apartment used to be my greatest enemy. Back then, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against my chest every night, reminding me that I was entirely alone. I was 22, staring down the barrel of a diagnosis that felt like a life sentence, and the one person who swore, on the altar, in front of our friends, in the sanctity of our shared promises, that he would be my anchor, had vanished. Mark didn't just walk away, he evaporated. One week I was vomiting into a porcelain bowl while he held my hair back, whispering that we would beat this together. The next week my phone was disconnected, the rent money was missing from our joint savings, and he was gone. He didn't even leave a note. He left a half-drunk cup of coffee on the counter that grew a skin of mold and a void in my life that felt like it would swallow me whole. I spent the next 6 months fighting for my life in sterile rooms, terrified, broke, and nursing a broken heart that hurt worse than the chemo. I learned to survive without him. I learned that the only person you can truly rely on is the one staring back at you in the mirror. 5 years later, I had rebuilt myself from the ashes. I was living in a different city, had a career I was proud of, and, most importantly, I was healthy. I had stopped looking over my shoulder for the ghost of the man who broke me. I was having a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind where the rain taps a rhythmic, peaceful cadence against the glass, and the tea is just the right temperature. I was finally at peace. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a frantic, desperate pounding. It was a soft, tentative touch, as if the person on the other side was afraid of the sound they were making. I assumed it was a delivery driver with the wrong address. I sighed, set my book down, and walked toward the entrance. I didn't bother checking the peephole. Why would I? I didn't owe anything to anyone. I swung the door open, ready to tell whoever it was to take their package and go. The man standing on my welcome mat was a shadow of the person I remembered. He was gaunt, his skin a sickly, translucent gray, and his clothes hung off his frame as if he'd been wearing them for weeks. His hair was thinning, his eyes deeply sunken and rimmed with a raw, jagged desperation. He looked like he had been living in a war zone, while I had been living in a garden. For a heartbeat, the air left my lungs. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate to escape. It was Mark. He stood there, trembling, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a frayed jacket that looked entirely inadequate for the autumn chill. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw a flicker of recognition, a flicker of shame so profound it made my stomach churn. "Elena," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed underfoot. I didn't know if you'd still be here. I didn't know if I deserved for you to be here. I should have slammed the door. I should have told him to rot in the hell he'd created for himself. My hand tightened on the brass knob, my knuckles turning white. I braced myself to scream, to demand answers, to throw the 5 years of my pain back into his hollowed-out face. But before I could draw enough breath to speak, his knees buckled. He didn't just stumble, he collapsed entirely, his body hitting the floorboards with a dull, sickening thud. I stood frozen, staring down at the man who had abandoned me at my lowest, now lying in a heap at my feet, his breathing shallow and erratic. I stepped back, my mind racing, but as he rolled slightly to the side, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His sleeve had hitched up and tucked into his waistband, partially hidden by his coat, was a heavy, blackened handgun. The sight of the steel glinting against his hip snapped me out of my trance. Every survival instinct I'd honed over the last 5 years screamed at me to run, to bolt for the fire escape, to call the police. But I couldn't move. My feet felt cemented to the hardwood, paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the moment. Was he here to finish the job he started? Was he here to rob me? Or was the man who had once been my world truly so broken that he had become a danger to himself and everyone around him? Mark groaned, his face pressed against the floorboards, his fingers twitching in a rhythmic, involuntary spasm. The smell hit me then, not just the stale scent of rain and cheap tobacco, but something deeper, something metallic and sickly. It was the scent of rot, the kind that clings to someone who has been living on the fringes of society, someone who has stopped caring if they live or die. "Mark?" I whispered, the name feeling like a curse on my tongue. He didn't respond. He just gasped, a jagged, wet sound that rattled in his chest. I realized then that he wasn't playing a game. He wasn't some cold-blooded intruder. He was a dying man. I knelt down, my rational mind screaming, "Don't get close, don't let him near you," and grabbed his shoulders to roll him over. As I flipped him, his eyes flickered open. They were bloodshot, pupils blown wide and filled with a terror that looked ancient. He tried to speak, but only a string of bubbles formed at the corner of his mouth. I looked at the gun again. It was shoved deep into his waistband, heavy and real. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and managed to slide it out from his belt. It was heavier than I imagined, a cold, unyielding weight that felt like a betrayal of everything I stood for. I scrambled backward, clutching the weapon, and pointed it at the wall, my breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. "What is this, Mark?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "You walk into my life after 5 years, looking like a ghost carrying a weapon? Did you come here to hurt me?" He stared at the ceiling, his chest heaving, ignoring my question entirely. He reached a trembling hand toward his own stomach, and that's when I saw it. Beneath his tattered shirt, the fabric was stained a dark, ominous rust color that had seeped through the layers of his clothing. It wasn't just a bruise. He was bleeding from a ragged, ugly wound that looked far too deep to be accidental. "They're coming," he wheezed, his eyes darting toward my front door, which was still standing wide open to the night. "Elena, you have to lock the door. You have to lock it right now." I looked at the open door, then back at the bleeding man on my floor. Outside, the rain had picked up, and through the gloom of the hallway, I heard it, the distinct, heavy sound of footsteps. They weren't the aimless shuffle of a passerby. They were deliberate, rhythmic, and getting faster. 3 pairs of boots hitting the concrete stairs, echoing up the stairwell with the precision of a hunting pack. Mark clutched my ankle with a grip that was surprisingly strong, his eyes pleading with me, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. "They followed me," he whispered, a tear carving a clean line through the grime on his cheek. "And now, they're going to find you." Suddenly, the heavy metal door at the end of the hallway slammed open, and a voice, cold, calm, and utterly detached, called out into the building, "We know he's inside, and we know he isn't alone." The sound of the door crashing against the wall in the hallway sounded like a gunshot in the confined space of my building. I didn't think. I moved. I lunged forward, grabbed the handle of my own front door, and slammed it shut, sliding the deadbolt home with a frantic, metallic clack. My hands were shaking so violently that the gun I had taken from Mark nearly slipped from my grip. I shoved it into my hoodie pocket and scrambled backward, my back hitting the kitchen island. "Who are they?" I hissed, my voice barely audible over the sudden thunderous pounding of my own heart. I leaned over Mark, grabbing his collar and pulling him toward the shadows of the small hallway leading to my bedroom. He was dead weight, his body limp and cold, yet his eyes remained fixed on the door, wide and frantic. "It doesn't matter who they are," he rasped, coughing up a fine mist of blood that splattered onto my floor. "It only matters that you stay quiet. If they see you, they'll—" A heavy, authoritative thud echoed against my door. Then silence. It was a suffocating, predatory silence that stretched the air until it felt like it might snap. "Elena," a voice called from the other side. It wasn't shouting. It was calm, polite, and terrifyingly familiar. "We know you're in there. We saw the lights. We saw him enter. You don't want to make this difficult for yourself. We only want what he stole from us. My blood turned to ice. I looked down at Mark. He squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling. "Don't answer," he breathed, his voice barely a tremor. "They'll kill you the second you open that door." I crawled toward the living room window, staying low to the ground to avoid the view from the street. I peeked through the blinds. Down below, a black SUV was idling, its headlights doused. Two men in dark, nondescript trench coats were standing at the base of the apartment complex steps, looking up. One of them was holding a device, a tablet or a scanner that flickered with a faint blue light. He adjusted his stance, then looked directly up at my window. I ducked down instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like I was having a cardiac event. I crawled back to the kitchen, where Mark was now trying to pull himself upright against the base of the refrigerator, his face deathly pale. "What did you take?" I whispered, my voice sharp with a mixture of terror and white-hot rage. "What have you brought into my house, Mark? 5 years I spent hiding from the memories of you, and you show up on my doorstep bleeding with people hunting you like a wild animal?" Mark looked up at me, his eyes glassy. He reached into his inner jacket pocket with a hand that was stained dark with his own blood. He pulled out a small encrypted thumb drive, heavy and reinforced with steel casing. "This," he gasped, his breath hitching. "This is why they abandoned me. This is why I left. I couldn't let them." He broke off into a violent, hacking cough, his head dropping forward. At the same moment, the handle of my front door began to turn, slowly, deliberately. They weren't kicking it in, they were picking the lock. I heard the faint, precise click of a tension wrench against the tumblers. The lock turned. The door began to creak inward. I stood up, the gun heavy in my pocket, feeling the cold weight of it against my hip. I looked at the door, then at the man who had destroyed my life twice over, and realized that I had only seconds before they entered. I pulled the weapon out, my hands finally steadying with a cold, terrifying clarity. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was a target. "Get behind the counter," I commanded, my voice devoid of emotion. Mark looked at me, a strange, mournful smile touching his cracked lips. "You were always the strongest one, Elena. I'm sorry I never deserved you." The door swung wide open, revealing a shadow standing in the hallway, silhouetted by the flickering light of the corridor. A man stepped over the threshold, his face obscured by a dark mask, a silenced pistol raised in his hand. He didn't say a word. He just moved with the lethal efficiency of a machine, scanning the room, until his gaze landed on me. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "Put the weapon down, Elena," the intruder said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register. "You're holding something that belongs to people who have no concept of mercy." As I stepped out from the shadow of the kitchen island to face him, the intruder's accomplice emerged from behind him, and my breath hitched. It wasn't a stranger. I recognized the face, a man who had been at our wedding 5 years ago, a man who had stood by Mark's side at the altar, smiling as he swore to protect us both. He raised his own weapon, his eyes meeting mine with a cold, hollow recognition. "Sorry, Elena," he said, stepping into the room, "but we can't let any loose ends remain." The room tilted. The man in my living room was Julian, the best man at my wedding, the guy who had toasted to our endless future while holding a glass of champagne, the same guy who had comforted me for weeks after Mark vanished, telling me that Mark was handling business and would be back soon. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, a sudden vacuum of air that left me gasping. "Julian?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. He didn't blink. He adjusted his grip on the suppressed pistol, his expression as blank as a storefront mannequin. "You were supposed to be dead years ago, Elena. When the diagnosis came through, we were sure the stress would take you out. It would have been cleaner that way. But you're like a cockroach. You just wouldn't die." The audacity of his words shattered the last remnants of my shock, replacing it with a cold, jagged fury that ignited in my gut. He hadn't just been a friend, he had been a spectator to my slow decline, waiting for me to expire so the business wouldn't have any witnesses. "You and Mark," I hissed, tightening my grip on the heavy handgun. "You destroyed everything. You took my health, my marriage, my sanity, all for a thumb drive?" Julian chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Mark didn't just take it, Elena. He got greedy. He thought he could leverage the company's secrets to buy himself a life away from the syndicate. He didn't account for the fact that we were watching his every move, every single day, even after he left you. We let him lead us right to you." Behind me, I heard a sharp, wet rasp. Mark was pulling himself up the back of the refrigerator, his face a mask of agony, his eyes locked onto Julian. Don't touch her," Mark wheezed, his voice straining against the blood filling his lungs. "It's all here. Every account, every transaction, every person you've laundered money for. It's uploaded to a server, Julian. If I don't check in by midnight, it's going to every major news outlet in the country." Julian's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, a crack in the armor. Fear. He was afraid of the data. "He's bluffing," the other man, the one in the mask, growled, stepping past Julian into the kitchen. He raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. My training, the instinct I developed while fighting for my life in hospital wards, the sheer, unrelenting will to survive, took over. I didn't think about the law, or morality, or the life I had built. I just thought about the last 5 years of being a ghost. I kicked the kitchen chair with everything I had, sending it skidding across the floor and catching the masked man in the shins. As he stumbled, I fired. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the apartment. The bullet went wide, shattering the glass of my kitchen window and sending shards raining down like diamonds. The masked man went down, clutching his shoulder, but Julian was faster. He dove behind the sofa, the silenced thwip-thwip of his pistol stitching a line of holes across the cabinets, right where my head had been a second before. "Elena, get down!" Mark screamed, lunging forward with a sudden, desperate burst of energy. He grabbed the masked man's ankle, dragging him back as he scrambled to aim again. I dove behind the island, the smell of gunpowder stinging my nostrils. My heart was a frantic drum beat, my ears ringing with the echo of the shot. I was pinned down, Julian was closing in, and the masked man was starting to fight back against Mark's desperate, dying grip. I checked the magazine of the gun I'd pulled from Mark. 2 rounds left. I peered over the edge of the granite counter. Julian was circling to the left, his gun raised, his eyes searching for a glimpse of my shadow. He was 10 feet away, 8 feet. He reached the edge of the kitchen, his silhouette looming over the counter. He took a breath, ready to round the corner and end it. "You should have stayed in the grave, Elena," he whispered, his voice dangerously close. I stood up, but not to face him. I turned toward the window I had just shattered, reaching out to grab the heavy iron fire escape ladder latch. But as my hand brushed the cold metal, a red laser dot danced across my chest, steady and unmoving, coming from somewhere in the dark building across the street. The red dot danced across my sternum like a pulsing, malevolent heart. I didn't have to look to know what it was. A sniper, positioned in the high-rise across the alleyway. Julian saw it too. He froze, his pistol half raised, the predatory grin vanishing from his face as he realized the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was a liability. "Stop!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking as he looked toward the window. The sniper didn't hesitate. A single muffled thump rang out from the dark, followed instantly by the shattering of the glass shards, still clinging to my window frame. Julian didn't even have time to scream. He crumpled to the floor, his chest blossoming with a dark, wet stain, his own weapon skittering across the hardwood and coming to a rest against my sneaker. Silence rushed back into the room, heavier than before. The masked man, seeing his partner downed and the sniper's sights now likely tracking him, panicked. He scrambled backward, abandoning Mark, and sprinted for the front door. He didn't even look back as he threw himself into the hallway, his boots thundering down the concrete stairs until they faded into the rainy night. I stood there, trembling, the handgun still clutched in my sweat-slicked palm. The red dot remained on my chest for a heartbeat longer, as if contemplating its next move, before it blinked out of existence. The sniper had been hired to clear the room, not to make a mess. If they wanted us dead, they would have finished it. But the silence that followed felt like a different kind of threat. I dropped the gun and fell to my knees beside Mark. He was slumped against the refrigerator, his life force seeping into the floorboards. His breathing was a wet, rattling nightmare, his eyes losing focus as the adrenaline finally deserted him. "Mark," I sobbed, the anger melting away, leaving only the raw, aching ghost of the woman who had once loved him. I pressed my hands against the wound in his abdomen, trying to stem the tide. "Stay with me. You have to tell me how to stop this. You have to tell me how to keep them from coming back." He looked up at me, his gaze clearing for one final agonizing moment. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers brushing my cheek. "The thumb drive," he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just a list of names. It's an insurance policy, my bank codes, the encryption keys. It's all in there. But Elena, you can't trust anyone. Not the police, not the agencies. They're all on the payroll." "Then what do?" I screamed, tears blurring my vision. He leaned in close, his lips grazing my ear. He whispered a name, not a person but an address, a deep web protocol that sounded like a fever dream. "Go there. Log in. Burn the whole world down. Don't let them have it." His hand went slack. His head lolled against the fridge, and the frantic, shallow rhythm of his breathing stopped. The room went deathly still. I sat there for a long time, holding the hand of the man who had ruined my life, the man who had finally, in his last breath, given me the keys to destroy his killers. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I walked over to Julian's body. He was dead, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I reached into his inner pocket and pulled out his phone. It was locked, but I had his face. I pulled his chin up, let the front camera scan his dead eyes, and the phone clicked open. I didn't call the police. I didn't call for help. I walked over to my desk, sat down in the chair I had occupied for 5 years of safety, and opened my laptop. I plugged in the thumb drive. The screen glowed, white and blinding, illuminating the dark, cluttered room. As the files began to load, I saw the magnitude of it. Thousands of pages of names, bank accounts, and evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of government and corporate power. Mark was right. This wasn't just a list. It was a wrecking ball. I looked at the Upload All button. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I thought about the hospital bills, the chemo, the cold nights spent alone, and the man lying dead on my kitchen floor. I thought about the life I had built, the quiet, the peace, the safety, and realized that none of it was real. It was all a fragile illusion, a glass house waiting to be shattered. I looked at the door, half expecting the masked man to return or the sniper to fire again. But the hallway remained silent. I had 2 choices: walk away, bury the drive, and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, or press the button and turn myself into the most dangerous woman alive. I closed my eyes, remembered the sting of betrayal, and pressed down. The progress bar began to tick forward. 10%, 30%, 60%. Across the city, digital gates were swinging open. The truth was leaking out, and there was no power on earth that could stop it now. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. The same city that had been my prison. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the woman waiting for a miracle. I was the storm. And as the distant sound of sirens began to rise from the streets below, I knew that for the first time in 5 years, I was finally, truly free.